My name's Tom, if I haven't met you before, and I'm going to start by praying. God, please take this time right now and make it useful. Please make it not just a couple of worldly spatterings, but make it something where your word hits people's hearts. Please make our 2019's years that glorify you, protect us from backsliding and push us forward, particularly in holiness. Please use this time right now. And everybody said, Amen. I just want to start by celebrating you. Well done on coming to church today. In case you haven't noticed, this is the hardest day in the calendar year to attend church, and you made it to church. So well done. I'm just really glad that you're here. We are so far ahead on where we were this time last year, even though it feels small today. This is like more people in this one room than we had at church around this time last year in one service, and we had a whole nother thing at 9 a.m. So we're really excited. We feel like we're going forward. I hope you feel like we're going forward, and I want to celebrate the fact that you came to church today. Well done. We are going to be talking about New Year's resolutions. We're going to be talking about how to start your 2019 strong. But there are a lot of us in the room who have just a little bit of skepticism, myself included, about New Year's resolutions, right? And you'd be justified in having that skepticism. So I was looking up the stats a little bit earlier this week, and the CommBank actually does this sneaky thing where they measure where all of their people's money is going to. It's a little bit scary, but they know whether or not you're spending money at the gym or not. And they done the stats and they put them out. They said that in December versus January, 69% increase in people paying for gym memberships. The opposite trend, 45% decrease December versus January in people buying cigarettes and alcohol. You can see how this all relates to New Year's resolutions. But then you'd be right in being a little bit skeptical because you can almost chart what's going to happen during the rest of the year. The gym memberships are going to go down. People are going to drop their gym memberships. Or to be honest, the whole gym membership industry seems to be tailored to the idea that you will pay but not actually show up. And so it's right to be skeptical about New Year's resolutions. As I was thinking about that and trying to work out, are these things valuable though? I was reading a little article by a guy called Paul Tripp. Basically anything he writes, I commend it to you. And he says, life change is less about one big moment. It's more about the 10,000 little moments of change. The 10,000 little moments where you realize, I don't want to be like this, I want to be like that. The 10,000 moments where you realize, that's not the way of a Christian, I'm going to change that. And so if you're someone who's skeptical about the idea of New Year's resolutions, can I encourage you today, make some resolutions, but make them as part of your 10,000. Let's be people who are changing continually throughout the year, but this is as good a time as any. It's probably better to just put your foot in the ground and say, here's where I'm going in 2019. This is the direction I want my life to go in. And so here's my proposal. We're going to use Isaiah 61 to try and shape some worthwhile New Year's resolutions. That's what we're going to be doing today. Now, if you haven't been with us recently or you're new today, this is part of a series. We've done a 6-part series in the book of Isaiah. This is the 6th part. Now, we did chapter 6, which is this great picture of holiness. It helps us care about God's holiness. But for the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at these 4 servant songs. It's 42, 49, 50, and 52, 53. Now, these servant songs are exceptions in the book of Isaiah. Most of Isaiah is written kind of God to people or Isaiah to people, but there's these 4 passages that we've been studying where the tone kind of changes and it seems like there's this individual who is called the servant who is speaking, and with New Testament hindsight, we look back and we say, the servant is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. So how does that fit with Isaiah 61? Well, Isaiah 61 is this kind of debated, possible 5th servant song. And you can tell how people got to that conclusion, right? Because there is also this kind of tone change at the start of Isaiah 61. It says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. And it starts seeming as if maybe this is the servant speaking again. And in the same way that Isaiah 52, 53 is quoted in the New Testament, we had the story about the Ethiopian and Philip. This one, Isaiah 61, is quoted directly by Jesus about himself, which was Luke 4 that Amy read for us before. So that's kind of where we are in the bigger picture of the series and why we're studying Isaiah 61, but I think it's a great place for us to launch in and trying to form some meaningful New Year's resolutions. In order to do that, let's open up your Bibles if you've got one. I'm going to try and show you a problem in this text that's going to lead us to form something meaningful of a resolution. Let me show you a problem. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim, 1, the year of the Lord's favor, and 2, the day of vengeance of our God. So there's the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance. There's these two specific things that this servant or whoever is speaking here, Jesus identifies himself as this being fulfilled in him. But you get to the Luke 4 passage and you realize there's a problem with the way Jesus quotes it. If you've got the Luke 4 passage, try and flick over there with me. Listen closely. So unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. Good. Because he has anointed me. Good. Same. To proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he stops. And Isaiah 61, there's 2 different days. Well, there's the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance. Jesus rocks up and he says, I'm here to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And at that point, when I read it, I was thinking, so what about the rest of the passage, Jesus? You can't just drop out all of the vengeance stuff. If I did that, they'd say I was a really bad preacher. So what's going on there? And to deepen the conundrum for you for a second, have a look at these 2 verses in the book of John. They're right next to each other. God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. Sounds kind of year of the Lord's favor kind of stuff. The Father judges no one, but he has entrusted all judgment to the Son. Sounds very much day of vengeance kind of stuff. So which one is it? How can John construct his book and just 2 chapters apart have 2 statements that seem so contradictory? Is Jesus here to proclaim favor or to proclaim judgment or both or what? Because it seems like his quote finished a little bit prematurely. Can you see the problem? Now this is hopefully going to lead us to something very, very helpful, which will help us make a resolution. Amy, I'm going to grab those 2 chopping boards off you if that's okay. It's time for some props. I got slain on Weekend Away earlier this year for using too many props, and I haven't used them for like 6 months, but they're back. So here we go. When you look at prophecy in the Old Testament, it's helpful to remember that they had a glimpse of the glory. They kind of got it, but they didn't see everything with the same New Testament hindsight that we do. So, for example, in Isaiah 61, they say there's this person's going to come, he's going to bring the year of the Lord's favor, and he's going to bring the day of vengeance. And so he's going to bring some stuff, one thing. And that's kind of the perspective that they saw everything from. And that was true, but with a New Testament perspective, we can see something additional to their true insight. And that is that from your perspective, in the New Testament, you can see there's actually 2 things going on. You know, you look at it, it just looks like one, but actually from the side-on view, you go, oh, there's 2 days going on here. There's 2 distinct comings of Jesus. There's 2 distinct things that he's going to do. And so when we're dealing with the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance, thanks so much, Amy, with New Testament hindsight, we can split that into 2. And we actually live between those 2 fulfillments. We live kind of between what we would now see as the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus came and he brought that and he proclaimed it, but he didn't really bring the day of vengeance. So in the language of John, kind of at his first coming, Jesus was not sent into the world to condemn the world. He came and he saved the world. It's talking about what he did on the cross. He made salvation for you and for me possible. But there will also be a day where he will be the judge. And we live between those 2 days. Here's how this helps us to make resolutions. If you can see the year 2019 in the Bible historical timeline, it'll change the way you live it. If you can see and realize, the world was created, here comes the Old Testament, Jesus shows up as a real time marker there, and he brings about salvation, he dies on the cross, he kind of roughly brings the year of the Lord's favor, and we're about to live in 2019, and the day of vengeance is still coming. The Bible uses the term the last days. It's that whole period between Jesus and when Jesus comes back, between kind of Jesus and what he did, where his primary work was about salvation there, and Jesus, as he will come back, and a much more significant part of his work will actually be judgment, and he will sit on the throne. And here's why that matters for us. Why don't you make a resolution, or why don't you just make it one of your 10,000, to live 2019 in light of the fact that there is a day of vengeance coming? How would that help? That would change the way you used your finances, for example. You would say, I really care that other people experience God's favor and not his judgment by putting their faith in Jesus before he comes back. And so I'm going to give some extra money to someone who's helping that happen. Or I'm going to set aside some money that I'm going to use to try and make that happen. It would change the way you used your time. You would say, you know what, I am going to go and spend a little bit more time with people who don't know about Jesus because the day of vengeance is coming and I love them. And so I want them to experience God's grace right now and to bow the knee willingly instead of unwillingly at that last day. If you've got kids, if there's a day of vengeance coming, isn't it like of the utmost importance that your kids grow up in the knowledge of the Lord and stick with that God? Isn't that surely one of the most important things you could possibly prioritize with your year? I'm really glad you came to church today. I hope you're starting to think about what's important to me in 2019 in the big picture of everything that's going on. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you, is that we live between those two time periods. And I'd love to take you to verse 1. We're going to try and come up with a second resolution here, a second insight. Have a look at verse 1 with me. Now, this is what Jesus quotes, and he says, this was fulfilled in me, right? So as you're reading this, have a look through and say, okay, how did Jesus fulfill this? By the end of this process, we'll come to another resolution. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. Now I got no problem believing that Jesus fulfilled that, because Jesus went out and John the Baptist was doing some baptizing, and Jesus said, me too, please, and the Spirit of the Lord comes down during his baptism. So I go, great, that first line seems to be very clearly fulfilled in Jesus. And at that same moment, because the Lord has anointed me, God says, hey, this is my son whom I love, listen to him. I go, okay, it seems like God is on Team Jesus as well. I got no problem with line 2 being fulfilled. Line 3, no problem either. To proclaim good news to the poor. That's what Jesus said, right? He said, blessed are the meek, blessed are the kingdom belongs to the poor in heart. But then it gets a little bit more complicated. It gets a little bit harder to tell exactly how Jesus fulfilled this. It says, he sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. Now, how did he fulfill that? To make your thought process go one level deeper again, consider John the Baptist with me. Now, John the Baptist, in Matthew chapter 14, talks about how he's imprisoned. He is literally captive. And at that point, if I was John the Baptist and I was in someone else's prison, I would be thinking to myself, oh, okay, no, Jesus is here. He's the one that this was all about. He's going to proclaim freedom for the captives. He's going to bring me out of this darkness as a prisoner. This is all going to end well for me as John the Baptist. But that's not actually how it goes. It ends up that John the Baptist dies in that situation. He is never released, and yet Jesus is around and here. And how does Jesus fulfill freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners? to try and help us understand what Jesus actually achieved and what this means, John chapter 8 is really, really helpful. It's not going to come up on the screen, but John chapter 8, verses 34 to 36. Listen to him really closely. This is part of a broader conversation, but Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." John 8. And that ties in with a consistent teaching the whole way through the New Testament that culminates in a sentence something like this. Jesus sets people free from their captivity to sin. Jesus sets you free from your captivity to sin. Now, let me break that down into a couple of different groups of people to whom that could apply. If you're here and you're not a Christian, you're still kind of thinking it through, firstly, really glad you're here, starting 2019 on a great step forward. But if you're not here, can you see the offensiveness of what Jesus just said? He just said, you're not free. Now, that's funny because sometimes when we sin, we're thinking, this is freedom. You know, God tells me not to do something, I'm doing it, and so I'm free. Or God tells me to do something, I'm not doing it because I do what I want, I am free. And Jesus says, you're not free. You're not free at all. You're not trailblazing. You're just copying what everyone else has done, which in itself is just copying what Satan did. Rebelling against God, you're actually not free at all in sin. It's incredibly offensive. Helpful to realize that the offer of the gospel, the offer of what Jesus lays on the table to you, if you were to become a Christian, is to transfer your loyalty from a bad master to a good master, from a life-sapping master to a life-giving master. Christianity is something in which we still have a master, but he is such a good master. It's a transfer of loyalty from one master to the other. And so that's, if you're not a Christian, you're still considering it. Let me take you into a second group of people. A lot of us in the room right now would call ourselves Christians, and I would love to come to the beach with me in your mind and consider with me people who are not Christians, but from your perspective as a Christian. Now, one of my favorite things to do on the weekends, if I get a day off, is to go to the beach, right? And I love to go to Maroubra Beach. That's my happy place right now. I like to take my sand. I like to take my board shorts. I like to take my surfboard. I like to take my book. I love the coarse rubbing of the sand on my legs. I love the feeling of the sun on my arm. I love the cool, refreshing water. And you go to Maroubra and you just have a good time. And some days are just stunningly beautiful. You know, it's the perfect temperature. It's warm, but not too warm. The waves are just this nice peeling 2 to 3 foot. There's not much wind. Everyone's having a great time. Everyone's smiling. And it is so hard in that moment to see the world with the spiritual lens that Jesus would have us see. Where we look around and we don't just see nice people having a nice time. Where we see there is a deep problem with the world. The God who made us is not being worshipped as such. And other things are being worshipped in his place. And these people I'm looking at, even though they seem like they're having a really nice time right now, the Bible tells me are actually captive to sin. Does that stir you? Can you see it with the spiritual lenses that Jesus would have for us? And so that's freedom, what's on offer for you if you're not a Christian. That's as Christians, and we're considering those who are not. Third and final category, this is probably the most helpful for us as the group that we are, is just as a Christian. What does it mean that Jesus came and fulfilled, proclaimed freedom for the captives? And this is going to take us to a New Year's resolution, I hope. You've been freed not only from the punishment for sin, but also from its continuation. You are no longer bound to sin. Jesus proclaimed freedom for you from your captivity to sin. And so, in 2019, you can make progress in your holiness. You can make progress against sins that have held you back all of 2018. That is possible for you. Now, you can take this too far either way. You can take this too far and you can fall into what is called sinless perfectionism. Now, sinless perfectionism is the idea that because Jesus has set me free, I'm not bound to sin, and so as my life goes on, I might even have a whole year where I do not sin once. I become sinlessly perfect because I'm freed. I'm no longer a captive. I am completely free from the whole of sin. I can sinless perfectionism. Now, that probably doesn't work because in 1 John it says anyone who claims to be without sin is a liar, and that's written to Christians alongside our experience. And so we know, okay, sinless perfectionism is too far in terms of the freedom for captives idea. But I would suspect that if you're anything like me, you don't fall very often over that way. You probably fall over this side of the scale. You probably fall into what I'm going to call defeatism, where you go, okay, I'm just a person, I'm a sinner, so I guess I'm just going to do that sin. Because everyone's a sinner, right? We can never be free until heaven, and so I'm just going to be defeated by this. I'm just going to lay down, I'm just going to have this hang over my head and leave it there. Because I actually don't have any freedom from sin. I'm totally enslaved to it, aren't I? And if this is you, which I think we probably fall over this side of the scale a little bit more, can I just exhort you to look really closely at what Jesus has done? He has given you freedom from your captivity to that sin. You are not a slave to it. And so in 2019, you can have progress against the sins that have dominated your 2018. For each of us, it might be different what that thing is, but I kind of encourage you to think about it, name it to yourself, and say, you know what, part of my resolution for 2019 is that this is the year where I'm really going to fight this particular sin because I don't need to be bound by it anymore. Jesus pays the penalty, but he also frees me from its ongoing power. In a minute, we're going to sing, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. And that is true. Now, if I've lost you, come back with me. Here's where we're up to. We've talked about 2 different resolutions. The day of vengeance is coming. That's where 2019 sits, and so let's live in light of it. Additional to that, you are not captive to sin. And so you can make New Year's resolutions to push forward in that. When you fail, repent, get back up on your feet again, go again. That's okay. Let's move on. Let's go to verse 3. I'm going to show you some more treasures in this passage. If you've got chapter 61, verse 3 in your Bible, you're going to want that. This is what Jesus brings. Jesus is a God. Jesus brings reversals into people's lives. This paints an incredibly positive picture of what 2019 could be for you. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Now, this is written at a particular time, a very long time ago, not directly to us. So what did this mean to the original people at the original time? Well, God's people had been militarily defeated. And when you get militarily defeated, the custom at the time is you sit on the floor and you put ash on your head. There is no mourning, there is no joy, and apparently they put all the oil away for a little bit. There's no joy in your town. There is only mourning. There is a spirit of despair that just pervades the whole nation once you've been militarily conquered. And this is a picture of restoration that God is promising to his people. But ultimately that's fulfilled when Jesus, for God's people more broadly, achieves all of these things. You notice the reversals, how beautiful that is? To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. And notice that last little section in verse 3, last little phrase, for the display of his glory. And so this is a helpful little corrective as we think about 2019 and what 2019 is going to be about for you, what's top of your radar. New Year's resolutions can be very me-focused. They can be very inward-focused. But we like to say this a lot at Grace City. We say that God is all about God. And God is radically God-centered. Now, it would be weird if you or I were all about you or I, because the world is not actually about you or I. But God actually did create the earth. It actually is the middle of it. It actually is the center. And so it is the best way for God to be all about God. As we think about 2019, can I encourage you, make your year not about building your own splendor, but about building God's splendor. Or just reflecting God's existing splendor, because he's already beautiful. Last little section, 61 verses 5 to 6. 61, 5 to 6. Strangers will shepherd your flocks, foreigners will work your fields and vineyards, and you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of our God. You will feed on the wealth of nations, and in their riches you will boast. Now, I found this possibly the most difficult section of the passage to understand. It took me the most time to really wrestle with. And the reason for that is the first time I read it, and to be honest, the second time as well, I was quite put off by the image that is here. You know, this is written to God's people. They've been militarily conquered. It kind of read the first time to me as if God is promising them that they will become the conquerors and they will now become the tyrants and everyone will serve them. And you will have lots of slaves and the strangers will do all your work for you and you'll feed on all their wealth and their riches. It was a little bit off-putting to me. I had to work quite hard, and I have to say this very carefully, but think about it for a second. That kind of does happen today and has been happening for thousands of years as people like you and me willingly join Jesus. Right? We kind of are the strangers who shepherd the flocks of God's people, who do the work. And as people willingly come to Jesus, they bring their wealth and their talents and their riches, and they make this meaningful contribution. And the church is this beautiful, diverse thing throughout the world, including here, because of all of these, because of the fulfillment of this, really. But notice particularly the middle two lines. And you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of our God. That would have been kind of a new concept and kind of an old concept to the original hearers, right? They were used to the idea of having priests. They were like, yeah, we've got priests. This whole kind of tribe within our nation is the priestly tribe. They're called the Levites. They do all the priest stuff. But what's unusual about this is that it seems to suggest that outsiders, those from not Israel, will acknowledge that the whole nation and not just one particular subcrew have some kind of special connection to God, have some kind of special relationship with him. And it seems like God is indicating that in that day when these amazing things happen, which we now know is fulfilled in Jesus, everyone will be a priest. Everyone who follows Jesus will be a priest. Now, that's not a totally new idea, because back in Exodus 19:6, he takes them out of exile, and after he's done that, he says, although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Not just the Levites, but this bigger picture. And then you get it again in Isaiah 61, and then
really gets kind of driven home for us in the New Testament. You flick almost all the way to the back and you go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. And listen to this. This is written to Christians. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness in his wonderful light. The idea is this. There is not a distinct priestliness about any individual in this room. Right? Now, Tim over here is our lead pastor. Tim is not a priest. Well, he kind of is a priest, but only in the same way that you, if you're a Christian, are a priest. And the Reformation was partly fought along these grounds. You know, Martin Luther and his buddies got together and they thought, hey, it seems like we've kind of reinstated this priesthood. But 1 Peter 2:9 and Isaiah 61 and Exodus 19 are trying to tell me that there ought not be like one person who does the special stuff and everyone else just can't. But we are a kingdom of, that's what we are together. And here's why this matters for your New Year's resolutions. You are a priest. Priests are different from everyone else. And it would make sense if your New Year's resolutions looked different to those of the person sitting in the cubicle next to you in the office. Because we are priests of the Lord. And one of the main things that priests do is they were supposed to offer sacrifices, right? That's kind of a special priestly task. And so you're thinking, well, we don't offer sacrifices anymore because Jesus was the sacrifice once for all when he died as our substitute on the cross. But we kind of do still offer sacrifices. Listen to Romans chapter 12. Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, all the priests, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And so I think here's all I'm trying to push. I'm trying to say, you're a priest. You are specially set apart for service to God. How could that frame your 2019? So we're pretty much there. We're pretty much done. One piece of really helpful advice I got, this is not from the Bible at all, this is just worldly advice. Someone said, don't try and make like 17 resolutions. Just pick one or two, you know? And start hard, go hard on them. Maybe you'll get them done halfway through the year. That'd be great. And so I think my question for you, and this would be great fodder for post-church discussion, do you have resolutions? Are you a resolution person? But more importantly than are you a resolution person, how could God change you in 2019? How could you start 2019 on the front foot? What kind of a resolution or decisions could you make? Let me give you some specific examples. First point today was that the day of vengeance is coming. And so, maybe for you, a great resolution could be this. I am going to expand my circle of people who don't know Jesus. I'm actually going to connect with some people. I'm going to connect with 3, 4, 5, you put a number on it, in a meaningful way. Or maybe I'm just going to pay more attention to the people who I already am around, people who don't know Jesus, because I am convinced that one day Jesus really is coming back and he's going to be a judge at that moment. And those who have not willingly bowed the knee will unwillingly be forced to bow the knee at that day. But I don't want that for my friend because I actually love him. Maybe that could be your resolution. Maybe for you, you realize that in 2018 you have been captive to a particular sin. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's a relationship that you know you're in and you just really know you shouldn't be in it. Maybe you just, the more you look at your finances, you go, man, I'm greedy. I'm greedy, flat out. Whatever it is, can you name your sin? Can you identify it and say, 2019 is the year where I'm not captive to that. And I might fall back into it once or twice. I'm not sinlessly perfect, but I am not bound to it anymore. And in 2019, I can make progress away from that sin. Maybe that could be your resolution. Because Jesus on the cross as your substitute, he paid the penalty for your sins, but he also released you from the burden of needing to continue in those sins. So why don't you make 2019 just a time marker where you push that forward? Band, you guys can come up. I'm going to pray, and we're going to sing these truths. God, thank you for the people who you drew together today. Thank you so much that you are gathering more and more people here, and thank you for the people you saved in 2018 through this church. Please help us to start 2019 on a really strong foot, and please make 2019 a year where lots of the people in this room change in really great ways. Please protect us from backsliding. Protect us from the temptations that would draw us away from you in 2019. Please make us a more holy people. We realize that our sin actually just doesn't fit and doesn't make any sense. And so please change us. We want to be changed. We don't want to finish next year in the same place we started it. But God, thank you so much for paying the penalty for our sin. And thank you that we don't have to fear the day of judgment when it actually comes because we have our faith in you and what Jesus did on that cross. Thank you so much for that. And God, you are so good to us even when we're not good to you. And if you agreed, you said, Amen.